American gang culture didn't start in the 1980s. It started almost 200 years ago in a neighborhood so dangerous it made modern gang territory look like a suburb. Today I'm breaking down every major gang in US history, from the very first crew to the international empires operating right now. And it starts with the one that wrote the playbook. 40 Thieves. Before the Crips, before the Bloods, before the Mafia ever set foot in America, there was a crew running the Five Points neighborhood of New York City in the 1820s. The 40 Thieves, widely considered the first organized street gang in American history. Their headquarters, the back room of a grocery store owned by Rosanna Pierce. They ran an entire criminal empire out of a place that sold bread and vegetables up front. The Five Points was home to the Old Brewery, a single building packed with roughly 1,000 of the poorest residents in New York. That's the world the 40 Thieves recruited from. Street kids with zero options, orphans with nowhere to go. That playbook of locking down territory and turning violence into revenue? It's been copy-pasted for 200 years. But here's the thing, they weren't just criminals. During New York elections in the 1830s and 1840s, political machines hired them as enforcers, brass knuckles as campaign strategy. Every single gang in this video exists because the 40 Thieves proved the model worked. And the gang that came next? They took that model and turned it into an all-out war. The Bowery Boys. Most gangs try to hide from the law. The Bowery Boys literally were the law. Well, close enough. These guys were volunteer firemen. Actual city-recognized volunteer firemen who fought fires during the day and fought rival gangs at night. They emerged in the 1830s out of Manhattan's Bowery neighborhood as a direct counter to the Five Points gangs. And by the 1850s, they had somewhere between 50 and 200 active members roaming the streets in the most ridiculous uniform you've ever seen. Stovepipe hats, massive belt buckles, suspenders, and fire company insignia they straight up stole from real departments. But here's the thing, being volunteer firemen wasn't just a day job, it gave them organizational structure, access to weapons, and legitimate standing in the city. They used fire company politics as a full-on cover operation for gang activity. Nobody questions the guys putting out fires. And when things escalated, they escalated hard. The 1857 riot pulled in roughly 1,000 participants across multiple gangs, fought with clubs, bricks, and whatever wasn't nailed down. One of the largest gang battles in American history. Now, some historians argue these guys were really just immigrant communities defending their neighborhoods. And there's truth to that, but the Bowery Boys pioneered something far more dangerous than street brawling. They figured out how to infiltrate legitimate civic institutions and weaponize them. That exact playbook would repeat with labor unions, political machines, and community organizations for the next century. But if a gang hiding inside a fire department sounds creative, wait until you see what happened when organized crime discovered an entire economy could be built on illegal alcohol. Chicago outfit. Most people think Al Capone built the Chicago outfit from nothing. He didn't. The foundation was already there, decades before Capone ever picked up a gun. Back in the 1890s, Italian immigrants in Chicago were terrorized by Black Hand extortion networks. Pay up or lose your business. Pay up or lose your family. These weren't random criminals. They were organized, methodical, and deeply embedded in immigrant communities. By the 1920s, guys like Big Jim Colosimo took those networks and formalized them into something with real structure. Capone didn't invent the machine, he just put his name on it. But here's where it gets insane. During Prohibition, the outfit was pulling in an estimated $300 million a year in 1920s money from bootlegging, gambling, prostitution. That's not a gang, that's a parallel economy running alongside the actual city of Chicago. And then came February 14th, 1929. The Street, Valentine's Day Massacre. 7 rival gang members lined up against a garage wall and executed. That single event made Capone internationally famous and permanently defined how Americans think about organized crime. But the outfit's real innovation wasn't violence, it was structure. When Lucky Luciano organized the National Commission in 1931, the outfit earned a seat at the table alongside New York's 5 families. That kind of influence from a single city outside New York was almost unheard of. By the 1960s, the outfit had roughly 300 made members and thousands of associates embedded in politics, labor unions, and legitimate businesses across multiple states. The FBI was still tracking active outfit enterprises well into the 2000s. This wasn't a street gang anymore. It was a corporation with a body count. And if you think that level of organization is terrifying, wait until you meet the group that took the motorcycle and turned it into a weapon, Latin Kings. Most gangs operate on unwritten rules. The Latin Kings sat down and wrote an actual constitution. We're talking roughly 20 pages of formal organizational doctrine, complete with ideology, rules of conduct, and a structured hierarchy that reads more like a government charter than anything you'd associate with a street gang. And that contradiction is exactly what makes the Latin Kings one of the most fascinating criminal organizations in American history. They started in 1954 on Chicago's West Side, formed by Puerto Rican and Mexican American youth who adopted black and gold as their colors, representing death and life. From the beginning, they built something different. A formal hierarchy with a corona at the top, warlords beneath, and structured member ranks that gave the whole operation a quasi-governmental feel. By 1977, Chicago membership alone had crossed 1,000. By the 1990s, they'd spread to 34 states with an estimated 25,000 to 50,000 members nationwide. Drug trafficking revenues hit over $100 million annually, alongside protection rackets, weapons distribution, and human trafficking. But here's the tension that defines them. That constitution doesn't just outline criminal operations, it frames everything through cultural nationalism and political ideology, youth empowerment, Latino pride, community building, all written in the same document that governs a drug empire generating 9 figures a year. No other American gang has ever tried so formally to justify its own existence on paper, and that paper created a permanent record of the contradiction between the mission and the reality. But if you think a written constitution makes a gang strange, wait until you see what happens when a gang becomes an international export. Hell's Angels. On March 17th, 1948, a guy named Otto Friedli gathered a bunch of World War II veterans in San Bernardino, California, and started a motorcycle club. Sounds innocent enough, but here's the thing about these veterans. The government trained them to be extremely effective at violence, shipped them overseas, and then when they came home, basically said good luck and offered zero support. So yeah, they didn't exactly ease back into civilian life. They designed the now iconic Death Head logo that same year, slapped it on a 3-piece patch, adopted red and white as official colors by the early 1950s, and accidentally created one of the most recognizable brands on the planet. 75 years later, you can show that logo to someone in Tokyo and they know exactly what it is. Membership jumped from around 300 in 1960 to over 2,000 worldwide by the 1970s. Chapters across California, New York, and multiple countries. They became the first American gang to operate as a genuine multinational organization. But the real jaw-dropper is this. By the 1980s, Hell's Angels controlled an estimated 70 to 90% of methamphetamine distribution in California. Let that sink in. That's not a motorcycle club with a crime problem. That's a drug cartel with motorcycles. The feds launched Operation Rough Rider in 1985, which resulted in over 55 federal indictments across multiple chapters. And that's the legacy nobody wants to talk about. Every outlaw motorcycle club that came after them copied their exact model: turn a hobby into a hierarchy, build international operations, launder the money. Sons of Anarchy made it look cool. Reality was a meth empire on 2 wheels. But if you think a biker gang running California's drug trade is wild, wait until you see what was being built inside California's prisons at the exact same time. Mexican Mafia. In 1957, 13 guys in a California prison decided to build an empire. And they did. The Mexican Mafia, La M, was founded at Doel Vocational Institution in Tracy, California by Luis Huero Buff Flores and roughly 12 other inmates. From day one, this was not a street gang that ended up in prison. This was a prison gang built specifically to operate inside a cage. They established a formal hierarchy, a strict black and white color code, and a governance structure designed entirely around incarceration. That distinction matters more than anything else about them. Here's why. Traditional gangs work from the outside in. You build power on the streets, and that power follows you into prison. La M flipped the entire model. They built power inside the walls and projected it outward. By the 1970s, they controlled an estimated 80% of the drug trade in California prisons. Not a piece of it, most of it. The state thought it was running those facilities. It wasn't. Membership grew from about 50 in 1960 to over 500 by 1980, but those numbers are misleading because tens of thousands of street-level affiliates were taking direct orders from incarcerated leadership. La M didn't didn't need to be on the streets. They had people for that. By the 1980s, estimated annual revenues hit over $100 million through narcotics, extortion, and weapons, all coordinated from behind bars. 13 inmates in a vocational prison built a 9-figure operation without ever walking free. But if a prison-born empire sounds extreme, wait until you hear about the gang that tried to start a revolution from the exact same place. 18TA Street Gang. Every gang on this list has one thing in common. They care about race, who you are, where your family came from, what you look like. That determined whether you got in or got killed. 18th Street threw all of that out the window. Founded in the 1960s in LA's Rampart District, 18th Street grew out of Latino gang traditions, but with one massive difference. They let anyone join. Black, white, Asian, it didn't matter. If you wanted in, you were in. That made them one of the first truly multiracial street gangs in Los Angeles history, and it gave them a recruitment advantage that nobody else had. While other gangs were turning away potential soldiers over skin color, 18th Street was absorbing entire neighborhoods. That open door policy fueled one of the fastest growth trajectories of any gang in LA. By the time law enforcement started paying serious attention, the gang had spread across multiple neighborhoods and was pulling in recruits at a rate nobody could keep up with. Estimates today put their total membership somewhere between 30,000 and 50,000 worldwide. That's not a street gang, that's a small army, but here's where it gets really interesting. Starting in the 1990s, the US government began mass deporting gang members back to Central America, especially after the 1996 immigration reform law. Those deportees didn't stop being 18th Street. They brought the gang with them. El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala. An LA street gang became a hemisphere-spanning criminal network, and it happened because of US deportation policy. The government literally exported the problem it was trying to solve. And if you think that backfire was bad, wait until you hear about the gang that followed the exact same pipeline but made it even worse. Black Guerrilla Family. Most gangs on this list started because someone wanted money, territory, or protection. The Black Guerrilla Family started because someone wanted a revolution. In 1966, George Jackson, W.L. Nolan, and roughly 50 inmates at San Quentin State Prison founded an organization built on Marxist political theory and prisoner rights activism, not as a side hustle. As the entire point, they used military-style ranks, formal ideology, and a genuine belief that the prison system could be dismantled from the inside. Philosophically, there's nothing else like it in American gang history than George Jackson was killed during a 1971 prison escape attempt at San Quentin, and instead of collapsing the organization, his death supercharged it. Martyrdom is the most powerful recruitment tool on earth, and BGF membership swelled to an estimated 200 to 500 core members with over 1,000 associates by the mid-1970s. They were predominantly African American, but formally open to other racial backgrounds, which set them apart from nearly every other prison gang operating at the time. But here's where the story gets painful. By the 1990s, the revolution was over. The ideology, the Marxism, the prisoner rights mission, all of it quietly dissolved into drug trafficking and extortion pulling in an estimated $10 to $50 million annually. The political ambition didn't survive contact with economic reality. It never does. And that's the most instructive part of BGF's entire history. Can a gang simultaneously be a genuine political movement and a criminal enterprise? They tried harder than anyone. The answer was still no. But if you think ideological contradictions make a gang complicated, wait until you meet a gang that was built on pure, uncut chaos from day one: Aryan Brotherhood. Most gangs on this list started on the streets and worked their way into prison. The Aryan Brotherhood did the exact opposite. It was born behind bars, and it never really left. In 1964, a group of white inmates at San Quentin State Prison formed the Brotherhood out of what they claimed was pure survival logic. They were outnumbered by larger racial groups and felt they needed protection. But here's the thing, what started as self-preservation curdled into something far uglier. Full-blown white supremacist ideology became the foundation, and violence became the entry fee. To get in, you had to earn it with blood. Literally, the blood initiation meant committing a violent act, usually against another inmate, to prove loyalty. Once inside, you answered to a rigid 3-tier hierarchy with a supreme leader at the top. The discipline was extreme, partly because leadership was almost always incarcerated, but the smartest thing the Brotherhood ever did was control access. Estimates put overall membership and associates somewhere around 15,000 to 20,000 people. But the inner circle of fully patched members stayed deliberately tight. That layered structure made them nearly impossible to infiltrate. It took a massive federal indictment in 2002 to finally crack the leadership. 16 national leaders convicted, dozens of regional commanders taken down. The largest coordinated federal takedown of a prison gang at that point, but even that didn't kill it, because when your entire organization is designed to operate from inside a cell, prison isn't a punishment, it's home base. And that makes the next gang on this list even more alarming, because they took international expansion to a level nobody saw coming. Crips. In 1969, a 15-year-old kid named Raymond Washington decided he was tired of getting pushed around, so he and Stanley Tookie Williams built a gang on the east side of Los Angeles. They called it a Neighborhood Protection Association. They claimed about 50 blocks of South Central, and within 2 decades it became one of the most recognized criminal organizations on the planet. Here's what makes the Crips different from literally every other gang on this list. There was never a central authority, no boss, no chain of command. What Washington and Williams created was essentially a brand, blue bandanas, the C hand sign, and a loose set of principles that any crew in any city could adopt. It was a decentralized franchise model before anyone had a word for it. By the late 1980s, over 30,000 members operated across 600 plus affiliated sets in LA alone, and the gang had spread to nearly all 50 states. But the Crips were already tearing themselves apart before that expansion even happened. Just 2 years after founding, the East Side and West Side split in 1971, triggering internal wars that killed thousands through the 70s and 80s. The crack epidemic of the 1980s poured gasoline on all of it, turning local drug corners into national distribution networks with zero coordination from the top. And then there's Tookie Williams, the co-founder who wrote children's books from death row, who got nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize, who had international advocates begging for clemency. California executed him in 2005 anyway. Whether you see that as justice or tragedy says a lot about how you view redemption, but it gave the Crips something almost no other gang has ever had, a genuine moral debate attached to their name. But if you think the Crips story is complicated, wait until you hear about the gang that was literally created to destroy them, Bloods. Most major gangs in American history formed around a neighborhood, an ideology, or a hustle. The Bloods formed for one reason, survival, and that makes them unique in almost every way. In 1972, the Crips were expanding so aggressively across Los Angeles that smaller gangs faced a simple choice: join them or get destroyed. But a handful of groups chose a third option. They banded together, roughly half a dozen separate gangs: the Peru Street Boys, Denver Lanes, Brims, Looters Park Hustlers, Bishops, and others formed a coalition under a single banner. These groups didn't share territory, they didn't share culture, they shared exactly one thing: a common enemy, and that was enough. Here's the thing: forming a multi-gang alliance on the streets of Los Angeles requires serious political thinking. These weren't organizations with PR teams and negotiation consultants. These were teenagers and young men in some of the most dangerous neighborhoods in America, building a military coalition from scratch. They adopted red, established the B hand sign, and created an identity out of opposition. The growth was staggering, approximately 1,000 members in 1973. By 1990, the LA County Sheriff's Department counted over 8,000 Bloods across the county. By the early 2000s, that number had exploded to an estimated 20,000 plus members, with sets in all 50 states and a growing international presence. A defensive alliance became a global force. But the most fascinating moment came in 1992, when Bloods and Crips leadership brokered the Watts Truce, one of the most significant gang peace efforts in American history. The truce held for months, long enough to prove peace was possible, not long enough to make it stick. And the defining irony of it all, the Crips, by becoming powerful enough to threaten every other gang in LA, accidentally created the one rival that would match them on every level and outlast every attempt to destroy either side. The Bloods exist because the Crips were too successful, and now neither organization can be separated from the other. But if the Bloods were born from opposition, the next gang on this list was born from something even more volatile: war, displacement, and a level of violence that would shock even the hardest streets of Los Angeles. Angeles. MS-13. Here's the thing about MS-13. Every gang on this list was born from some combination of poverty, survival, and opportunity, but MS-13 might be the only one that was accidentally built by the United States government. In the early 1980s, thousands of Salvadoran refugees fled to Los Angeles, escaping a brutal civil war that was tearing Central America apart. They were teenagers, mostly between 13 and 18 years old, arriving in a city that already had deeply entrenched gang territory. Established crews like 18th Street weren't exactly rolling out the welcome mat, so these kids did what every vulnerable group in this video has done. They banded together. They called themselves Mara Salvatrucha, a name combining Mara, Salvadoran slang for a tight crew of friends, with Salvatrucha, meaning street-smart Salvadorans. The identity was baked in from day one. By 1989, roughly 300 members operated in Los Angeles, a few hundred teenagers in one city. That's it. That should have been the entire story, but then the US started deporting Central American gang members back to their home countries in the late 1980s and through the 1990s. And this is where it gets dark, because that decision didn't destroy MS-13, it exported it. Deported members arrived in El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, and Nicaragua, countries already shattered by decades of war and instability. They brought gang structure, recruitment tactics, and American street gang culture to places with zero infrastructure to resist it. The result was catastrophic. By 2005, MS-13 had exploded to over 50,000 members across Central America. By 2020, US membership alone reached 10,000 to 15,000 across more than 40 states, with heavy concentration on the East Coast and Northern Virginia. They became known for machete killings, beheadings, and torture. An estimated 0 homicides across Central America by 2010 are attributed to MS-13 and the broader violence they accelerated. 300 LA teenagers became a transnational criminal organization operating across 2 continents, and the single most effective growth tool in their entire history was American immigration enforcement. The US government tried to solve a local gang problem and accidentally built an international one. That's not just ironic, that's the defining story of American gang culture itself. Problems created, exported, and returned worse than they left. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more, click the video on the screen now.